is a CPD. This is a CPD event. That is, it is a continuous professional development event, and it carries a value of 2 CPD points. Please contact our secretariat to have your CPD information forwarded to you should you wish to claim those points for your professional designation or body. A bit of housekeeping. Please note that these sessions are ran as follows. We will introduce our presenter, who will present for between 30 and 40 minutes. We then open the session to our general audience to ask questions and interact with our guests. This is done either by raising your hand, at which time the moderator will acknowledge you and invite you to ask your question. Alternatively, you can post your question in the chat and the moderator will answer the question on your behalf. We ask that you please mute your electronic device unless you're asking a question. My name is Vincent Jones, and I will be your moderator for this evening. We have an exciting and very timely topic this evening, where we will be looking at design of coastal defense systems in light of sea level rise and changing weather patterns. Our presenter for this evening will be Engineer Antonio Rowe. Antonio works for the coastal, he's a deputy director at the Coastal Zone Management Unit. And I'll just give you a little bit of background shortly on Antonio. But before we get into the meat of the matter, as it were, for this evening, I just want to give you a couple notices. As some of you may be aware, this is the 60th anniversary year for the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers, and we will be having a week of activities coming up, starting at the end of September, September 9th, and we'll run that week right through to October 4th. So we're going to have September 29th at 9:15 a.m. We're going to have a church service to start the week, and that's to be held at St. George Parish Church. On October 1st, we're going to have a webinar, 6 p.m. as usual. On October 2nd, we'll have a tour and a members line, and you will get more information on these activities as we get closer to the time. And that's going to be starting at 3 p.m. on October 2nd. And then this year, our awards dinner is going to be a little earlier. It's going to be October 4th. And we are very fortunate to have Her Excellency, the President of Barbados, will be our patron for the evening. And we are fortunate enough as well to have the former Chief Justice, Sir Patterson Cheltenham, who will be our guest speaker for that evening. So want you to dust off your tuxedo and your glad rags, as it were, and prepare yourself for what should be a very interesting evening as we celebrate those members who would ascend to become fellows within the organization, where we would recognize the engineering project of the year, and where we will recognize those persons who have been integral in their activities pertaining to engineering in Barbados that we'll recognize as honorary members. So we want to encourage you to start thinking ahead, putting a little money one side so you can come out and support the association on that great evening. Come out, mingle, mix with your peers, take photographs, and make it an evening to remember. So that is October 4th, and we'll have some information within the next couple of weeks to ticket sales, etc. So Kenton has just put up the flyer. You'll see a flyer like this or similar will be circulated out in the next week or so, just so that you can save the dates for these activities. And as I said, there will be further details for each activity coming out very shortly. So we want you guys to participate, and we want you guys to, as I said, to make a night of it on the 4th. It's good to come out as peers, friends, invite your colleagues from across the industries, and let's come out and celebrate each other. The doctors and the lawyers and everybody else celebrate their achievements. We, as professionals within the engineering sphere, we also need to celebrate and recognize our achievements. So I encourage you to do just that on October 4th and to join us for the other events that will be occurring that week. Also, for those of you who are interested in volunteering any time to the association in the coming months, please contact the secretariat and let us know. We often get contacted by schools who are having professional days for when they get professionals to come in and speak about their professions. We also have activities pertaining to speaking to persons who are wanting to go into engineering field of study. And we do get contacted at the office for various things of that nature from time to time. Or if it is that you would like to serve in some capacity, perhaps you have been feeling a tug and you want to do a bit of give back, we invite you just to contact the Secretariat, and we are happy to fit you right in so that you can have an opportunity to give back to the organization and by extension to the island. So that is something to note. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker for this evening, Engineer Antonio Rowe. Engineer Rowe is the Deputy Director of the Coastal Zone Management Unit. He has a BSc in Civil Engineering and an MSc Engineering in Maritime Civil Engineering. He is a registered professional civil coastal engineer with over 25 years experience and is responsible for supervising the 3 technical sections. Those are the marine, engineering, and coastal planning within the unit. Engineer Rowe also provides engineering reviews of all of Barbados's major coastal infrastructure projects, those proposed or completed, either through the regulatory role of his office or his position on several of government's project steering committees. Engineer Rowe previously held the position of project manager of the project execution unit within the Coastal Zone Management Unit. This project execution unit was responsible for the execution of the coastal infrastructure program that ran between 2003 and 2009, which was a jointly funded program between the government of Barbados and the Inter-American Development Bank. This program was responsible for the construction of 3 major coastal infrastructure projects in Barbados, inclusive of the Sir Richard Haynes Boardwalk, which is considered one of the best examples of improving shoreline resilience against the threats of climate change in small island developing states. And also Engineer Rowe served as the director of the island's drainage division, with responsibility for the island's flood alleviation interventions and the maintenance of the island's drainage infrastructure. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Engineering from the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus, and his MSc, Master of Science in Engineering in Maritime Civil Engineering, was done at the University of Liverpool in the United Kingdom. Now, before we ask Antonio to get going, Antonio, you can bring your camera on and stand by. Before we get Antonio going this evening, Kenton is just going to run a short video just to basically refresh our minds as to happenings in Barbados very recently, where the importance of coastal zone management and coastal zone design and the things we do on the coast comes into sharp view. So Kenton, can you run that short video?
July 1st, Hurricane Beryl slammed into Barbados, leaving a disaster in its wake. The storm surge from Beryl caused significant damage to fishing vessels at the Bridgeton Fisheries Complex, leaving approximately 65% of the vessels damaged and more than 26 sunken vessels. The state of the fisheries industry is a national emergency. Through our $1 initiative and support from our donors, BECT was able to respond. Over a 4-week operation, BECT dive team successfully cleared marine debris and recovered damaged and sunken vessels. Supplies were donated to fishermen to aid in this cleanup process. Still, the journey to recovery is a long haul. We need your help to restore our marine environment. Donate today.
So there you had a video from the Barbados Coastal Conservation Trust, I think it is. And I'm sure Antonio is going to clarify a couple statements that were made there, which I learned about just now, and I'm sure some of you will learn about tonight. So Antonio, I don't want to take any more of your time. I know you have quite a bit of information to share with us, and I'm hoping that we will have some very interesting discussion after. So Antonio, without further ado, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jones. Good night, colleagues. And I would like to thank the association for having me come and shed a bit of light on this whole issue of climate change and sea level rise and how that is integrated into coastal engineering design. I just wanted to say, I was looking at the slide or the video that was just shown there, and I just wanted to say that Beryl was very interesting hurricane. Passing to the south of Barbados made it particularly challenging for us because normally hurricanes would pass east and then go up the north and be on their way. When the hurricanes pass the south, however, that is a specific challenge because the south and west coast beaches are rather narrow and they don't have a lot of protection and buffer area from those large high energy waves. So you tend to get a lot more damage when those hurricanes pass to the south. It's a very powerful hurricane, and you want to be thankful that it was quite a distance away, that we didn't get the full force of those winds, and by extension, the waves. So I am going to share my screen now so that I can go through the presentation and show how we, as coastal engineers, tend to deal with sea level rise, and more importantly, climate variability, or what we say as one of the major potential impacts of climate change, which is more intense storms or higher frequency of more intense storms. We must have to be able to capture that in our design process so that our engineering structures are designed over the long term to be able to, meet their objectives given those changing parameters. So I'll just share my screen so we can. So just asking if everybody can see, or one person can confirm that the screen.
Yeah, we
everybody
can see your screen, Antonio. You're good.
Screen? Okay, cool. Good. Give me a minute. My computer is very. There you go. Okay, so topic we have is design of coastal defense systems and letting sea level rise and changing weather patterns. Just a quick slide to show the outline of the presentation. So just a quick introduction on those little, parameters that made us aware that we had to consider these little changes. I'll do a couple of slides on how sea level rise influences coastal engineering design. Very basic, because I don't want to bore people, very basic with climate analysis so that I can explain how we capture the climate variability in extreme event analysis. And when I say extreme event analysis, I mean analysis of waves due to storms. 2 slides just putting everything together so that I can just quickly summarize so you can see the steps, and then finish off with some other engineering designs which are more in the realm of planning for people in the group who deal with applications and submit applications on the coastal zone. Now, working in the coastal environment, how structures and the beach and all the components there adjacent to the coastal area, how they react with changes in water level really has occupied our mind for quite some time. Prior to climate change, the water level changes we were most concerned with would be things like tides and storm surge, and of course waves and so on. I just want to say here that I don't want people to keep confusing surge and waves. They have different meanings in the coastal engineering spaces. Surges really tend to be associated with a change in water level due to a pressure drop, as opposed to waves, which is wind pushing the water and creating waves. So I know people tend to talk about storm surge cause damage, storm surge damage, storm surge damage. but sometimes that's actually damaged by waves. The fact that the two of them could occur simultaneously is probably the reason why people tend to lump them together. So previously, as I said, the concern prior to any talk about climate change and sea level rise due to melting polar caps and so on. The major concern as it relates to water level changes was to do with tides, which can be very large in some parts of the world. Barbados' tide range is it's less than a meter really. But in some places in England and Liverpool, where I studied, you have 6 meter tide ranges. So that difference can cause, certain issues, especially in ports and harbors where boats may get grounded off if they're in a port and the tide drops like 6 meters. But from around the 90s, when they started talking about sea level rise through the global warming, it is something that had to be considered by coastal engineers. The thing is, though, when people hear 2 millimeters a year sea level rise, people ask, why are you concerned about that kind of insignificant rise, especially when you're talking about tidal ranges at 6 meters and surges 2 and 3 meters, excuse me. Why 2 millimeters a year is not, in the grand scheme of things, a big deal. However, when you consider the lifetime typically in coastal structures, so 30, 40, 50 years is supposed to be around, then that 2 millimeter, 5 millimeter a year, cumulative, adding that on over the time, and you want your structures to be achieving their objectives over the lifetime, then it becomes a significant change in water level, which as I go through this presentation, I will explain why that is very important as it relates to waves and their energy, which is the real destructive component that we have to deal with as coastal engineers. Now, well, I just more or less said this slide. The coastal defenses really and the beaches, they're actually more respond to sea level changes based on what the wave climate is at their location. You would appreciate that structures on the East Coast where there's a very high wave climate, high energy wave climate, may respond differently, and the beaches differently to on the West Coast where there's a more sheltered or docile wave climate. So when we start to talk about climate change, climate variability, that potential to have more frequent storms or more frequent storms or more intense storms, that is going to be a challenge, because that will now have an impact on the generation of what waves, the direction and the magnitude of the wave heights and the power of the waves. And that is why we have to capture that in our design. So this picture here, you see this revetment that is rather disheveled, exposed to some high energy waves. And this is the point I'm making, that this, if we're going to expect more intense storms, then we do not want our structures to end up like this. This is an old structure though, and it would have been designed a little while ago. And since then, the wave climate has changed, bigger waves. And obviously it has been there for a while, so the components, the units, would not be the same mass and density that they were when it was designed. So the wave climate has changed, and the actual structural units also have changed, and they've changed in the opposite directions. One has gotten bigger, the other has gotten smaller. And so when I said that your designs have to take into over the long term, in order for them to keep, achieving their objectives, this is what the outcomes that can happen if that is not considered. Now, it is very critical that we capture any climate variability, supposed, proposed, and any sea level rise impacts during, it has to be embedded in the coastal design process, and it has been over some time. I don't want people to think that it is something new, or because lately there have been more storms, that is something that was not being considered. It has always been considered. It is embedded in the analysis that one takes when you are trying to get your design waves. And your design waves will then be used to build out your structures in terms of, well, in one instance, the day-to-day wave climate, I'll get to it soon, which will look at your operational day-to-day wave climate with set. So your orientation of your structures and your extreme waves, the hurricane waves, will deal with how strong your component is supposed to be. But we'll get to that in a minute. And the thing about long-term sea level rise, even if we were considering the increase in storms, long-term sea level rise can have an impact on your water depth, offshore and near shore. And your near shore water depth is critical because the deeper the water, the bigger the waves. The deeper the water, the further inland waves can traverse before touching the bottom, slowing down and breaking. So when you are doing your analysis of what your design wave is supposed to be, you need to be cognizant of the impact on sea level rise on your water depth at the location where structures are going to be placed, because if that water depth 10 years after you built changes from 1 meter to 1.2 meters, you'd be surprised what a change in wave energy that can bring. And I'll explain a little bit later. The other thing about the sea level rise component, and it just it's not just the sea level rise component when we talk about what I'm speak about, no, but it has an impact, is when you're doing your design water levels. And when I mean design water levels of the coast, I mean how tall or how high your structures are supposed to be so that they can actually carry out the functions. You have to make sure that you incorporate sea level rise among the other little components like wave setup and surge, because you do not want your structures to actually again become less functioning, or the objectives are less met 10 years into their life cycle. That's the whole point. The other thing too is that if you don't, heaven forbid, you build a coastal structure, a breakwater, a seawall, a revetment, and it just is easily overtopped before a storm that comes in because it didn't consider all these components, including sea level rise for your design levels. Because overtopping is a dangerous thing when it comes to coastal structures. It can cause scarring of material behind the coastal structure and destabilize it. That then leads to flooding, which you were trying to avoid by building the structure in the first place, and then its ultimate demise. So I sound like a stop record, but I just want to emphasize the importance of considering when we sea level rise, incorporation and consideration is so important. So having said what I said before, the truth is that because the sea level rise impacts the water depth, and the water depth has an impact on your wave climate, or how strong your waves are at the sites where your engineering structures are supposed to be, it is really, really critical that wave climate analysis in and of itself, both offshore and near shore, is so important to get that right and include all the climate change inputs necessary to make sure you cover off yourself in the long term. And it is in that wave climate analysis that you not only pick up the sea level rise, but you pick up the climate variability, which I will explain shortly. This is just something I picked up from a course I teach at university, just a basic slide, just to say that wave energy of the waves is just one of the most critical parameters that impact coastal structures. And there are a number of things that increase wave energy. Wave height, wave amplitude, which is half the wave height. The bigger the waves, the bigger the energy. That's a common sense thing. And the energy of the wave is proportional to the square of the wave height, the square. Wave height increases with two things, water depth and wind speed. And therefore, if wave height is that barometer that you use to determine how much energy you're going to get, and the higher the waves, the more energy you have. And the two things that increase it is water depth and wind speed. Then anything that affects water depth, any parameter, surge, wave run-up, sea level rise, and anything that affects wind speed, more intense storms or more frequent storms, which means getting that high energy wave more frequently. Those things you have to consider in your design. Now, when we are looking at trying to decide what our design wave climate is, there's a process how that works. We start offshore and then bring those waves inshore, because whatever the wave parameters are offshore doesn't mean that they're the same inshore, because as waves move from offshore to inshore, like any other wave, they will go through certain what's the word looking for? Things like diffraction, refraction, all those things that affect light, affect the water waves as well. So depending on your water depth, depending on if you have reefs near shore, which we call wave breaking, depending on the angle of approach, depending on the wavelengths, all those things literally affect the waves as they move from offshore to inshore, and the programs that we would use, Mike 21, near shore wave transformation, programs that bring those waves from offshore to near shore, but you need to get the offshore wave climate right first. Again, there are models that do that. You verify those models with wave buoys that are offshore. No, and these different people have offshore wave buoys. So when you run your models and you get your outputs, you can compare them to actual measured waves to make sure that your model outputs are correct. And likewise, when you bring them near shore, you do the same thing. It's called calibrating models. So first thing you look at is your offshore wave climate. I would have mentioned there are two types of wave climates. This, let me call it operational wave climate, which is just the day-to-day, normal day-to-day stuff. And then there's the extreme wave climate. That is the one that is set up by the passage of hurricanes and so on. Two different regimes. And similarly, that's offshore, and then obviously you have the same thing nearshore. So what you do, you look at your operational wave climate offshore, transform it to nearshore. You look at your hurricane stuff offshore, and you bring that into the nearshore. The operation, as I said before, the reason why we want to know what the operational wave climate is that when you're designing coastal structures like this one here at Welch's, and you want to get the orientation of your coastal structures right, your groins, your revetments, and so on, you want this beach to be stable pretty much during normal operational conditions. So that's why we use that wave climate to set up how long structures will be, if it should be pointing due north, east, west, or whatever angles. It's not only that, it's based on sediment transport analyses and so on. I don't want to get too deep into that right now. But the operational wave climate, how that impacts all the coastal processes will dictate how you align your structures. However, extreme event analysis now when you do that, that is where you looking at your big waves. What their inertial waves are going to look like when a hurricane is passing. I mean, and I guess later on I'll show you how we do that analysis that incorporates climate variability and sea level rise. But that extreme analysis is what you will use now to tell you how large your boulders will be, how strong your seawalls will be. And if you are building a seawall, I just want to mention throwing this here, and you do not have and you excavate, you don't reach any rock or hard material, this analysis, extreme wave analysis, and certain programs that look at cross-shore beach loss in terms of how far the elevation of the beach will fall. That kind of analysis will tell you, well, look, if a hurricane, 1 in 50 year hurricane pass, you will lose, the beach will drop by 6 feet. You will know your seawall foundation needs to be lower than that. And then you would put in your boulder protection around the front, the wall protect foundation. Because we're finding that a lot of the older walls on the West Coast, that they didn't account for that. When we have these storms and the beach elevation drops, the walls just topple over because the beach has fallen below the elevation of the walls. So, as I said before, jumping ahead in the slide, sorry. That extreme event analysis is what we use to make sure that coastal structures are properly sized, the components, the stones. In this picture, this is when we were doing the boardwalk and so on. We use granite, obviously a denser stone, less susceptible to abrasion by the sea than limestone. It's chemical erosion and so on. And I mentioned design elevations before, or we want these structures to be built to survive the extreme conditions. So the design elevations are used, are computed, using the extreme events. So you don't want them over top. I just want to do a couple of slides. I keep mentioning this thing about design elevations. I want to show it in pictures so you understand what I mean. The top picture is what we will call an emergent offshore breakwater. At no point in time is this below the surface. That has a specific purpose. As you can see, there's a beach that has been developed behind it. There's a word for this kind of beach, it's called a tombola. There's an equation that will tell you when these form, which is an equation with distance versus the height and length of the structure. I'm not teaching that, that's not the point today. The point is that this is a design elevation for a certain type of structure. This is a breakwater offshore the western end of the boardwalk, which is actually submerged at high tide. It's above the water at low tide. This has a certain objective, calming the water behind there, creating a proper bathing area. And then at Reed's Bay, St. Peter, the bottom double breakwaters, they're submerged all the time. And that was done just to stabilize this beach behind here, but they didn't want to cause it to build out too much because it would then end up smothering the reef. So, I say all that to say that you have to, if you don't consider sea level rise over the long term, in building these structures, you may find yourself that this one in 15, 20 years is always underwater, which is not what you wanted. And this structure may start to get water up to a certain level and lose the beach to some extent behind here. So sea level rise, remember, over the long term, coastal structures are supposed to last a certain amount of time. There's a lifespan for these things. And you want, during the lifespan, that the coastal structure achieves objectives. And the only time that you wouldn't expect that to happen is if you have an event that exceeds the return period that you design your structure for. At that point, then there's nothing you can do. All right. So just to drive home the point here, this is the top pictures of revetment, the bottom is the boardwalk. And you don't want those, again, to be overtopped, except as an event that is exceeding your design parameters, because the top picture is actually providing protection for the road behind it. You don't want that to get scoured and fail. And the picture that was shown just now in the slide, the miniature video we had at the beginning, and I know you all would have seen the slides with on the South Coast where the waves came over the boardwalk. The event obviously exceeded there's two things really. The event exceeded the parameters, that the design parameters of the boardwalk, but in some areas, and I'm just gonna slip this in here before I continue. As engineers, we would complete our analysis, extreme event analysis, and it would say that a structure needs to be X at X elevation. However, we live in the real world, and when you have your building projects that have to also mesh with society, stakeholders, and so on. So our initial design elevations at certain points of the boardwalk, when we took it to stakeholders, for instance, by tappers and so on, they said it was too high, that people would, you know, look down into their restaurant and look into their people's plates and so on. So we had to compromise and lower it enough that it would satisfy them, but not so much that it would compromise the objectives of the boardwalk. So, like I said, there were it was an extreme event passing to the south. They had some waves there that were coming from a Category 4 hurricane, and we had some overtopping. So, by way of just a picture to show, when I keep saying design elevations and what I'm talking about, in 2004, we were doing some work. We were supposed to do some work at Crane Beach, and we were supposed to build a walk. We moved the headland there and build a walkway so you could walk from one beach, the beach by Crane Hotel, over to the other beach that would take you then up to Ginger Bay. And we had to calculate design water levels, and you can see the different components. I'm sticking on sea level rise, but you can see there is it's not only sea level rise. You have to consider the tide, surge, wave setup, which in this instance was actually determined using the physical model, and then sea level rise. To get your design water level of plus 1.2 meters plus wave setup, which was also gotten derived from physical modeling. So as you can see, sea level rise is literally embedded in the computation. Now, I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, they had said that at that time, that sea level rise was some between 0.5 millimeters or 0.8 millimeters, 5 millimeters, 8 millimeters a year. And I think the consultants that did this job, I don't want to tell a lie, I think they picked a middle number, the median number, multiplied it by what was at that time half the design life, 25 years, and came up with this number. I suspect the reason for using half the structural life was you actually don't know if in 50 years what if the sea level would reduce or increase, but it was considered here. No, we want to get into the climate variability and how we capture that in our design. Now, as we said before, one of the potential impacts of climate change is more frequent storms, more intense storms, or a combination of both. So somewhere in our extreme event analysis, we're gonna have to find a way to capture that. This is just Worthing Beach in 2006. Believe it or not, this is not a storm. hurricane, nothing like that. This was during Easter. We had some swells. But what happened here was that the water was very warm and there was a slight elevation in just water level. And we found out through some analysis that Worthing Beach is very, very susceptible to just water level changes. So that a change in water level that caused the waves to get in further and erode the beach like this. That is actually, that manhole the guy is standing on is actually sewage manhole actually. So we had to get down here quickly and protect this area. Just an aside. I said before, any changes in wave climate can really change our design, extreme wave heights and periods and wavelengths and so on. So we need to get that analysis correct. So how we do? Now, generally speaking, when we doing our extreme event analysis for waves, it really is providing a theoretical distribution of the probability of occurrence of different wave parameters and storm surges associated with tropical waves over a long period of time. What I mean, you simply look at all the known storms that would have passed in the vicinity of Barbados for as long as there's a record, all the tracks, run those waves, run those simulations, and get all those wave parameters over time. So up to 1995, we would have finished off at Maryland. We run that test now, we get in Beryl. And all the other storms that would have happened since Maryland. So picture this from a statistical standpoint. The first data set up to Maryland, you run your analyses, and you may say, based on your analysis and all the wave parameters that you get out of that, that a storm that occurs once every 50 years will have these parameters. Fast forward to now, and we're saying that we getting more frequent storms and more intense storms. Add those to this data set now and run that analysis again, and you will find that your 1 in 50 year storm have different parameters, probably strong, bigger waves, longer periods, because of that increase in the amount of high energy waves you're having. So that is why, how you capture those changes in time. Because 20 years from now, that data set, then they're doing their designs for having all the storms that happen between now and 20 years from now. If it is that they're getting stormier, that will show up in the statistical analysis. If it isn't, if it levels out, or if it's actually getting less, that will also be reflected. So that in our extreme event analysis, that's what we use. That's what we use the statistical or probabilistic analysis, and not just stick to saying category 4 or category 5 or category 3. That's what we're using. We use a statistical analysis to try and capture those changes. Now, I know that when Beryl passed and the fishing harbor got damaged, I went to a couple of meetings and we said, well, look, anytime we do an extreme event analysis, and it would have been done for the fish, I'm sure that it would have been done for the fishing harbor, even though that was built, I don't know, in the early 80s, or late 70s, early 80s, long time ago. And when they did their analysis, it's a perfect example, really. When they did their analysis, they would have used what parameters they had up to then. And it came out that they needed 5-ton concrete units and so on and so forth. And the same analysis was being done and showed that, well, how many 1, 2 storms passed to the south and all the other storms passed to the north. So Beryl was a real mess up because it was a very strong storm passing a direction that's not normal, that not normally happens. And when you do your designs, you have to be very mindful of, in the end, which are the parameters you're going to use. One of the things in the statistical analysis, though, you have to decide upon is what we call a return period. A return period storm that you're going to use as the input storm for your wave parameters that you're going to use to build your structures. And it could be the Dutch. They use because of their situation below sea level, their exposure, they use a 1 in 1,000 year return period. And as a result of that, you could well imagine the kind of event we're talking about, and they build their structures to suit that. They must be enormous and expensive. When is an important parameter, we have to use it. So when we do our analysis, we will decide, all right, we can, for these structures, we're going to use a 1 in 100 year, because it is critical that these structures don't get damaged if anything less passes. For other things, we might decide, you know what, a seawall for a private property owner or a revetment to build a beach, we might decide, you know what, if we go to 1 in 100, that's going to be a massive structure. It is going to be almost impossible to build. We may not be able to have the materials in Barbados to build it. You want 7-8 ton boulders from the quarry. You might be able to get that, etc., etc. The point I'm making is that your design period, whatever you choose, return period, sorry, whatever you choose, it's not only about trying to protect something from the worst storm, but you got to look at the ability to maintain it, the ability to build it, and the cost. So in 1994, at a workshop, when Coastal was running our feasibility studies for coastal conservation, and we were doing our pilot projects, the first set of pilot projects in coastal engineering structures in Barbados. It was decided based on all the things I just said, that a 1 in 50 year return period we use for coastal structures. A minimum, sorry, a 1 in 50 year, 150 year minimum. That is not to say, based on what happened to the fishing harbor now, that one may want to look at a 1 in 100 year return period for things like the port, things like the fishing harbor, Coast Guard, and so on and so forth. But predominantly we use a 1 in 50 year return period for our coastal structures. Primarily, as I said, because you want to be able to build structures that you can afford to build and you can afford to fix, and that you can actually have the availability of the units in Barbados. So having identified what your return period is, you would then extract all your parameters based on all your probability, all your runs of hurricanes and so on. You would look at your statistics and say, okay, these are the parameters that look like, say, yeah, these things happen once every 50 years, or 0.2% are happening in 1 year. And you will use those wave parameters to determine your structure strength and durability, structure stability, and your design elevations. And therefore, you would have built in sea level rise and design elevations, and you would have used a statistical analysis which would have picked up any change, to pick up what the changes are over time with the storms, and use those to build your structures. So just in a nutshell, very quickly, 2 slides to say what I said of all those slides just now. You look at your operational and extreme wave climates, determine those, use your models, like the ones shown in the bottom picture, to bring your offshore waves inshore, so that you will have what your offshore and inshore wave climate is where your structures are being built. You would do an extreme event analysis, transport those waves in, get all those wave parameters, and then use that to design your coastal structures and your design elevations. Of course, it's not just about that though. All those same wave parameters you will also use to look at your sediment transport, look at the operation of the climate will tell you which way the sand is moving along the coast. Extreme analysis will tell you where that sand will go when the hurricane pass. Offshore, onshore, because don't forget, people seem to always think that extreme events will cause erosion and will move sand off the beach. But we saw with Beryl that in some instances, sand was pushed onto the beach across the road, and a lot of time was spent moving sand with bobcats and trucks from Oistins, Welches, Hastings, I think 6 Mens, and so on. So, depending on whether the waves are destructive or constructive, you can have sand pushed on or sand removed from the beach, and that will, but the erosion is what you're interested in because that will then tell you with your sea walls and so on, how far do you need to go to make sure that your wall is not undermined. Now, there are some, I know I understand there are architects and other people in the group, and I know that quite a few of you submit applications and then do work obviously for clients. So one of the other things you have to be very mindful of when it comes to sea level rise and more frequent storms is not only capturing that in the actual design of your components, your actual structural components, your engineering components, the breakwater and so on, but also how you plan on a coastal plot. Try as best as possible to set back properties as far away from high water mark as allowable on a beach. Now I know that all the beaches aren't wide. I know that on the West Coast in particular, it's almost, our plan says a minimum of 30 meters set back from high water mark. The reason for that is that the beach itself offers a buffer so that when the waves come in, they can expend their energy there rather than on a coastal structure, on a house. So one of the things I would like to say here is that as much as you can, and if you're dealing with clients, and if anybody, engineers, architects, anybody, try to impress upon them because they know they like to be close to the sea. That in this time is not something you would want to do. For instance, in Bass Rock, these houses that are right on the cliff edge where the cliff is starting to fail, that is not what you want to do. And some of these are newer than some. We have had to get calls about the cliff is failing and they need to do some put boulders and concrete under the place and so on, and look at the size of some of these buildings. So please, as much as you can, try and step back from the edge of the cliff, try and step back on the beach face. In terms of the ground floors, we've been asking people recently to make sure that your ground floor, if it is a hotel, if it is a condominium, whatever, try to ensure that that ground floor is not used for any kind of accommodation at all. Parking, reception, anything, but you don't want people's rooms and stuff down there that people can get injured, hurt, or the rooms get knocked out of use if we have a lot of high wave and storm cell activity that makes it up to your floor levels. If it's just reception or whatever, that sweep off that sand and you're up and running quickly. And of course, where possible, if you're close to the coastline, you can find a way for your home to be elevated so that any kind of surge wave passes under the building. And if the piles are cylindrical, allow for less drag, there's not a lot of wave reflection, the waves are allowed to dissipate, if any is allowed to dissipate under your structure and just run back down, then that, in terms of a design, in these times, is something that to try to look to support. And with that, I think I've come to the conclusion of the presentation. So if you have any questions, or if there's any other thing that on Beryl or anything so you all want to ask, if I can answer it, I will answer it.
Hey, Antonio, thank you for that very interesting and very in-depth presentation this afternoon. You shared quite a bit of information, and I would now, as you've invited, ask our guests to avail themselves of this opportunity to ask questions to you. You can do that, guys, by raising your hand. I will acknowledge, and then you can have verbal interaction, Antonio. If you're in a position where you're unable to do that and you want to put the message in the chat, you can do that as well. So Antonio, just as persons gather their thoughts, there are a couple stats that I was checking prior to today's webinar. And one that jumped out at me was some information that came from NASA, where they were looking at sea level change between 1900 and I think it's 2022. I think it is the date this one goes up to. And during that period of time, the sea level rise have been estimated to be about 212.18 millimeters between 1900 and 2018. And the information here, they say the infographic shows the rise in sea level since 1900. Pre-1940, glaciers and Greenland meltwater dominated the rise. Dam project slowed the rise in the 70s. Now ice sheet and glacier melt plus thermal expansion dominate the rise. So I thought that was interesting. And also to note the fact that according to NOAA in 2023 and their annual climate report, the increase in temperatures just about 2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1850. So obviously these are contributing factors, and feeding back onto what you said in terms of the estimations that engineers have to make going forward, because when you design a coastal infrastructure, you're not designing for today. Like you said, you're designing for down the road, and more importantly, you're designing for the worst case scenario. Given that we are seeing these increases probably steeper in the last 30 odd years or so because of the increase in everything that's going on in our climate, how reliable then does the information that the engineers have to design with, Antonio, becomes? What sort of assumptions are required going forward?
Okay, so there's a lot of stuff there to unpack. First, the sea level rise. Let's deal with that comment you made, like you said you saw. The sea level, the thing about sea level rise is that it is actually comparative sea level rise. Let me explain. But let me back up a bit. Now, a lot of people talk about glaciers, but they don't really think about thermal expansion of water. That is a real problem because of the rise in temperatures. The glaciers melting, it is really the ice that was on the land, not the ice in the water that melts. That's a problem. The ice on the land, that's the additional water that causes a problem. Now, the thing is that for some places, when the ice actually melts, that's on ice on the land that melts, those places actually rise slightly because it's the weight of the ice that keeps them down. So there are some places that are actually rising. Barbados is one, not because of ice, it's just our geology being on the plate, and we are actually rising at a slight angle. I can't remember I read those numbers a long time ago. There's a geological study done for us, and Barbados is actually one of the places that come out of the water. So it is really for engineers trying to and then and as you rightly said, sometimes you get the fellas that are talking about sea level rise give you a range between 5 millimeters and 8 millimeters. So it is your best guess really in terms of what you're going to use. Like I said, some people they say, okay, they say between five is the worst, the best case scenario, 8 millimeters is the worst case scenario. Some people will tend to just use the 8 and say, you know what, I go with that. Especially if you are a place that is below sea level already. So the Guyanas and let's say the Dutch, they use worst case scenarios for everything. 1 in 1,000 year return periods and stuff like that. But the reality is that, as I said, though, you can be constrained by what you are going to be able to build, what you can afford to build. Because as long as you start to, I don't like to use the word, push up your return period, 1 in 100, 1 in 200, then your design parameters start to go up, and then your structures start to grow in size and cost. And then you ask yourself, and then of course, it's a probability game too. Do you want to play it safe and build a structure with a return period of 1 in 200 and spend that money for an event that statistically, and then even the statistics is statistically going to happen? The probability is so small. Having said that, though, you can still have 2 of those events in a year. You don't know. So it's a lot of moving parts, but at the end of the day, for instance, we looking to rebuild the fishing harbor now. I went to a couple of meetings with the engineers that are looking at it, and imagine those concrete units, we call them dolos, that were out there, the concrete units that you see just easily moved, were 5 tons. Now we're hearing initially that in these now times, some 30 or 40 years later, that may have to be 15 tons. It may not, they're going to do the final study, the final evaluation. So it may not be 15, but so imagine now the kind of change in costs. If we could afford, can we afford to build that?
But Antonio,
No.
you make a very interesting comment there, Justin. I have some questions, one from Marissa and one from Monique, which I'm going to feed to you in a minute.
No problem.
But in this last system that we had, we saw the destruction to the fishing harbor, which is a completely younger structure than our deep water harbor. What potential risk then does the deep water harbor has or is exposed to in these modern times?
Okay, so we can talk about this all night, yes. This is the thing. There are some other factors though that you have to consider when you're looking at waves in particular. And one of the biggest, I just saw some underwater scans of seaward of the fishing harbor. And right where the most damage was done, there's actually a trench. The water is deepest there. So one of the things about the designing for these things is that because water depth is the limiting factor on wave height, the water harbor, if the water is shallower at the deep water harbor than where it is at the port, then you're not going to get the same size waves. All right. Okay. So a lot of that's why it's so important. I didn't want to get too much in the detailed engineering design. It's so important to have an understanding of your offshore bathymetry. What are the water depths? Because waves are depth limited. So truth be told, if the water depth is very shallow offshore, then it really doesn't matter how big the waves are offshore, because as they make their way in, they can break. Because if the water is just a shallow area. And
Right.
the longer and the wider that shallow shelf is, the further out the waves break, the less energy coming in. So
All right.
it really, at the end of the day, you may have two structures that kind of close in proximity, but the offshore bathymetry is the factor that decides what your design components will be because of the water depth.
Okay. So
You take
before I feed you these questions, Antonio, we have a mixed bag in terms of persons in the chat this
Mhm.
evening with us.
Mhm.
We do have engineers. I can see names of persons I've worked with here,
Yes,
colleagues and so on, and we
me
do
too,
have
yeah.
architects, but we also do have some students as well. And for
Okay.
the benefit of those students, could you very briefly
Mhm.
give us what are the differences between a revetment, a
Okay,
breakwater, and a seawall
sure,
and a groin?
sure. So the easiest one is the groin. I think people see those most on the coastline. So anytime you go to the beach and see a structure that is kind of like perpendicular to the shoreline, in other words, leaving the shore and going straight out to sea, that's a groin. Hold a minute. It might be better for me to if I could just reshare my screen
Sure.
quickly
Yeah, by all means.
so that I can, this is it. Okay. Oops. That was not what I had planned to do. Sorry about that.
No problem.
I'm using my laptop. It was very sensitive. So, okay, here we go here. Right, yo. Okay. And there's different combinations. In this photograph, you can see my cursor or no?
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Yes.
Yes.
This to a perpendicular structure is a groin. These are actually groin type structures, but we call them headlands because they have a shape like a natural headland, but they act like groins. They perform the same function. So groin is, for all intents and purposes, is any shore perpendicular structure that extending in that direction. This is a breakwater, but I have a better picture I want to show you. Right. These shore perpendicular structures are groins. These shore parallel structures that are right up against the shoreline, these are what I mean by revetments. So at Paynes Bay, there's revetments. These are usually used to protect the shoreline behind it from incoming waves battering the actual structures. Is a shoreline resilient structure. These groins are used to stabilize artificial beaches. So when you put a beach in the old days, they were used to trap sand, but we don't do that anymore. We actually fill the beaches in because if you're trapping sand, it's stopping it from going around. So these shore perpendicular structures, these groins are used to actually keep these beaches in place. The structures that are offshore like this or like this, these are called breakwaters. And they simply, as I said, because wave height depends on water depth, and these actually are used to artificially change the water depth and cause waves to break, because now these are shallow areas and reduce the energy the waves getting into the beach. That's typically how they work. So those are the three main structures. And then you have combinations of those structures. Sometimes the breakwater may have a part that connects it to the sand. So it's a shore connected breakwater and so on and so forth. But just generally that's the three basic units, and that's the difference between them.
And then the
breakwater-
seawall sits on top
and
of the revetment.
no, and the seawall now is just any normal wall that is by the shoreline. Let's see if we can find one here. Oh, sorry. These are Gabion baskets. Where baskets with rocks in it inside that perform like revetments just to protect the properties behind them. Let's see, and this is a seawall. This is a wall on the seaside.
Right. Okay, great. All right, Antonio, I'll feed you some questions we have here. The first one is from Marissa. Marissa is
Yes, Marissa, how are you?
Marissa is asking, in addition to the coastal setbacks imposed on coastal development projects, wouldn't the implementation of living shores, like the introduction of coastal planting, assist in the mitigation of damage due to sea level rise and storm surge?
Yes, it would. And then naturally things like mangroves and beach vegetation and so on, those are things that also can be used and are used, not mangroves so much, because unfortunately in Barbados, the whole south and east coast was mangroves. But of course, we didn't really understand back then the purpose. So they're all gone now and replaced by hard structures, unfortunately. So any location, I guess there's mangroves at, well, the Graham Hall is the big one, but that's actually cut off by the coast. And then we build the coastal roads too, which help finish off the mangroves. So Spring Garden still have a bit on the west coast, Port Town and Haywoods up by Sandals, and then big one by Graham Hall. But on the east coast now, we don't really have mangroves, but we have a lot of sand dunes and beach vegetation over there, and that is what protects them, because most of the storms pass that way. That's what protects that coastline from a lot of the erosion.
So Antonio,
I wanted to add, if you don't mind, Vincent.
Yeah, go ahead, Marissa. Go ahead.
I guess what I mean, I stopped typing because I said I could probably just stay.
Yeah, exactly.
So I appreciate you've implemented the setback for many years now. But just thinking what more can be added. Like I see town planning, or the planning office has been or the Town Planning Act has now included a percentage of vegetation or tree planting and so on. But coastal, I'm thinking is, there's more that can be done in terms of natural vegetation to be added as a planning requirement to assist rather than built structures. That's more what I'm getting at.
Yes. So
and whether or not that's the property owner that is required to implement the plantings, or if there is a program by coastal to
tree planting is not going to be us, and there is a tree planting program, and it is everywhere, not just inland. So NCC is currently.
I meant vegetation. I didn't mean trees.
They deal with vegetation. We get our vegetation from. They deal with all that. They are the what do you call a place to sell plants, trees, and vegetation. They are government's plant tree vegetation place. So if it wanted vegetation, say by the boardwalk, I would go to NCC and say, listen, please plant, please can we have, the problem is that we do that and then we see people with a hose digging up the vegetation. Because while we may think the vegetation is good for the beaches, and it is for beach stabilization, people will say it's not good for people laying on the beach. So we've had a lot of,
but you are the authority. So that's what I'm getting at, that if there is an intentional plan by whoever, whether it's coastal or NCC, to create a buffer along the coast of vegetation that would assist with these built structures that you just talked about.
Yeah, so
that could be considered.
We tend to, wherever we can, in our planning approvals or recommendations. Don't forget, I think people need to understand, and I think you understand it, Marissa, but coastal doesn't really have, unless it's to do with coral reefs and so on, anything to do with planning, we have no actual authority, like none. So we just make recommendations. They can summarily be dismissed by the people who actually make the approvals quite easily.
Right. I hear you.
Yeah, no, seriously. No, I
mean, I hear you loud and clear. I know it's tourism again. We promote
right.
white sand beaches. We don't promote
ground
cover on beaches. Yeah.
So if we set up somebody that their development must incorporate the vegetation or incorporate the trees, and some may try and some may say that they're not working for them, and you know, but we will make that recommendation. We always try to make that recommendation. And I think removing vegetation from the beach is actually, in one of the laws, it is actually against, it is, I think it's ours, and I think it is outside. See, removal of vegetation is actually against the law. I think we have our act is now being revised. So there's a lot of things in there in terms of penalties and so on that coming out for coral reefs and beach vegetation and so on, that, and seagrasses and all that stuff. That give us a little bit more teeth in terms of dealing with issues like that. But you know, it's a constant, as you know, the constant battle in the whole planning space, where the coastal zone is an area used by so many different people, sometimes with conflicting objectives.
Yeah.
And how you treat to vegetation, even setbacks, and all these different things you try to implement in planning from the cliffs and this. And I think people don't understand that when we ask for these things, it's not for our benefit. Meaning it's more to protect them.
Yeah.
Yes, it's from our side in terms of protection of the ecosystems, yes. But you know, because vegetation on the beach, I understand that assists with turtles as well.
Yes. Yes.
And that kind of, so you understand. So when you try to explain to people that it's not just about the aesthetics, but you know, the beach itself, the crabs and turtles and so on, that you need to have the vegetation there, not only for beach stability, but as habitat.
Right.
You know, to get some pushback.
It just struck me, those two images you showed, they're almost aerial views of Sand Street in St. Peter and it's Town and Welch's in Christchurch, how vulnerable they seem, and particularly in Welch's, how bare the shoreline. I mean, yes, it's a beautiful white beach, but I remember when there used to have lots of plants, lots of
you have to go up there now. You have to go up there now. Actually, Mary is on this call. There have so much vegetation. In fact, there's one side of that project that the beach is gone. It's completely covered with vegetation. Completely covered. So yeah, because we sent NCC to plant at some of those locations, and now it's, in fact, they have sand dunes down there now. The vegetation causing dunes to be built by Welch's. I mean, Shamari's like, you could say it, right? It was amazing when they passed this. So we have to actually hire people to monthly manage that vegetation.
Okay.
It's growing so fast. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks,
Next
Marissa,
question
for this
now.
interaction. Quickly before I go to Monique's question, Carl, I see you're on the call. Perhaps you could give a little insight to those who are here as to the recent impacts on the beaches as it pertains to the turtle project, and certainly what the lack of vegetation has meant along the coastline as it relates to the natural inhabitants of the shoreline. Would you like to offer a comment there, Carla?
Good night. Thank you, Antonio, for a great presentation. I'm more here to learn about coastal engineering and considerations and so on. In terms of the impacts of Hurricane Beryl, well, as Antonio mentioned, there was significant erosion on much of our coastline. Some locations on the west coast were particularly badly hit, as well as some on the south coast. We lost a lot of nests. So the nesting season officially started on the 1st of June, and it tends to peak at the end of June going into July. And so Beryl occurred on the 1st of July. So all of the nests laid prior to the 1st of July were washed away. The second impact that we saw, we actually lost a turtle. And that was as a result of a property owner cleaning his property as a result of sand intrusion. And the sand was piled up on the outside of the property against the wall. And the turtle came up looking for somewhere to nest. At that time, all of the sand was gone. And she climbed the mound of sand adjacent to the wall, went over to the wall and fell straight onto her head and crushed her head. Now, that was, an unexpected hazard. Nobody in the wake of a hurricane dealing with property damage and having to clean up is thinking, that there's going to be any consequence to just piling some sand against the wall. But we are very thankful to the NCC and the general manager there who assisted us with the removal of that sand and getting that hazard cleared up. We had some other incidents where turtles were coming up. In some cases, the beaches were extremely flat and they prefer a more steep slope. So they were going to the back of the beach and leaving the beach in some instances. We had some incidents where, again, sand was pushed up by the waves against walls. One notable location was Crystal Waters, and we had turtles falling over the wall into the Crystal Waters property maybe at least once a week for quite a few weeks. Now, on the West Coast, we've had some very, very, very steep berms created. And as the turtles have come up to try to find locations to nest, they have been falling off the berms on their return to the sea. And in quite a few occasions, they've gotten flipped over and they've been trapped on their backs. We had one that lost the use of one of its front flippers, getting trapped down in a ditch on the beach. In addition to that, in some locations, another impact, in some locations, the turtles have come up, not been able to get higher up onto the beach, and they have laid their eggs at the base of the berm. Now, as the beaches return, and the beaches have been growing quite well, Chilbar on the boardwalk is a good example. The day after the storm, there was not 2 grains of sand there, but the sand is almost back to the level of the boardwalk at present. So a lot of the beaches are coming back quite well. But what is happening is that all of the nests that have been laid at the base of the berms are now being smothered. So they would have been laid at typical nest depth, which is about 50 centimeters. It takes hatchlings 3 to 5 days to dig out at 50 centimeters. But then when you add another 2 feet of sand as the beach returns on top of those eggs, now you're getting a depth where the hatchlings cannot get out of. So they essentially will run out of energy and resources before they're able to dig out. And they will, if they're lucky, come out with no reserves, or if they're not lucky, they won't be able to get out at all. And then, of course, I guess the final impact I would highlight is the push towards, what's a good way to put it? Strengthening of beach structures. So in the wake of the hurricane, I think some properties sustained some damage. Other people just got very, very scared. Probably have never seen waves like that before. And so there's been a lot of coastal works. Antonia would maybe know a bit better than me, but I don't think I've ever seen the degree of coastal works going on right now ever before. And this is in the wake of some bad erosion. I remember we had so a couple of years ago, when Mullins Beach Bar almost fell into the sea, when it was completely eroded. Gibbs Beach was completely gone at the time as well. So we've had some bad erosion in the past, but I think the reaction now has been really quick. So there's a lot of coastal works going on, and we've had lots of people digging up nests. So the coastal works are occurring in the middle of the nesting season, and persons are just, they're excavating in some cases to put in revetments and to rebuild their seawalls. In some cases, they're putting down causeways. There's one property that has a causeway along the coastline, along the beach. And so those boulders that they put down and the heavy machinery that they would have driven would have put paid to any nests that were laid in those areas. So similarly to the kind of engineering concerns, we too have to kind of relook at how we do sea turtle conservation in the light of more frequent storms, and what are some of the things that we too may be able to implement. The planting of vegetation is great, and there are areas like Sand Street in Spikestown where you saw that the vegetation did have an impact. In some places, I think KFC on the boardwalk, they probably would have had significantly more sand. Because if you compare to Chilbar just down, every grain of sand got washed off that beach and pushed into the road and between the restaurants. Whereas at KFC, you did have significant incursion of sand, but a good portion of the beach, at least most of the beach that the sea grape was on, stayed in place. So you could see, between those two short areas, the impact that vegetation can have. So yeah, it's just a matter, I think, we're all, as Antonio mentioned, we all have different perspectives and different priorities. Antonio's and Coastal are looking at protecting the coastline, livelihoods, properties, investments, and the environment as well. We are looking at conserving species. Property owners are thinking about their properties, aesthetics, and other things. So it is just a matter of being able to find some type of common ground where we are all able to work together to ensure that the coastline of Barbados is protected. But while we're doing that, we mitigate as much as possible the impact on the species that use the coastline in addition to us, because I always like to mention that sea turtles were here first before people on Barbados. They were using the beaches first. And while for us, beaches are recreation and of course, economics, for them, they are tied to the coastline. And without beaches, they would not be able to reproduce and the species would be lost.
Carla, thanks for that conservation point of view. I thought that was very interesting and important to mention here. Because it bends our mind around the other considerations that we need to have. And I guess it does give some impetus to what was discussed between Marissa and Antonio as it pertains to beach vegetation and the advantage that could bring in terms of conservation and certainly retention of our beaches. Antonio, I'm going to bring you now a question from Monique.
Well, one second, Vincent. Let me just
sure.
very quickly just not respond, but just add to what Carla was saying there. Saying, confirming, yes, on the West Coast, once the system had passed, there was a fair amount of properties got damaged. And there is a emergency works clause in the Planning and Development Act now, which allows them to, to get their properties put back right. But as Carla is rightly saying, some people will panic and want to put back bigger stones and bigger things. Sometimes when Coastal would go and tell people, well, you need to just wait a bit. If we don't have, some people that didn't even have damage but want to put in structures, we would say, but hold on. The beach is going to return, barring another storm passing the following week or the next day. Give the beach a chance to respond. When we were in places where, as was discussed, seawalls were being built and so on, every one of our recommendations for emergency works actually says that you would have to speak to the sea turtle project. Before you start anything, they have to be notified, because we know that, they're going to be, once you're doing coastal work, depending on what it is you want to actually do, we're going to infringe on the beach face, where we don't know if any turtle eggs may have survived, or if anything may laid since. So again, having worked with Carla for so long, and Carla will tell you that she gave me a lot of lashes when she ready. So we have been trying to, as she said, understand that is a space for the turtles were there before us. Humans are, there and using it for a lot of different spaces, and trying to see how we could get that. It's obviously is a tug and go and a fight to continue trying to get to that place where there's minimal damage or minimal incursions on either side. Okay, the next question.
Balance is the word you're looking for, Antonio.
Balance, yes.
Yes. All right, so Monique has asked, I've never considered that some places are rising while the sea level is rising.
Correct.
That's quite interesting. Do you know if Barbados is rising at a higher or lower rate than the sea level is rising?
I can't remember. Oh, sorry. I was to say earlier, that's what it's called a relative. If you hear, normally, sometimes you hear them refer to a relative sea level rise, and that's where they use the word relative. It's relative to the land. I will have to, who was asked the question? What's your lady's name?
Monique Forbes.
Monique, I can't remember the exact number now, but because the actual sea level rise isn't a stationary number either, it may be that we are okay now, but who knows in 5-10 years. But yeah, but Barbados is actually rising at an angle, I think, see, brain a little old now, give me a break. I think it's tilted like the east side is rising out the water faster, I think. Like, I'll give me, I can, if you want, I can check it out. And,
By all
Thank
means,
you.
Antonio, you could feedback some information to the secretariat, because when we post the video, we could always post some additional information if needed be.
okay, no problem.
Thank you. I wasn't really looking for specifics. I wanted to know if sea level rise, it has like Barbados, does it impact Barbados the same way it would impact other islands? Because you know some islands are shrinking, and you just told me Barbados is rising. So
Yes, most definitely the ones that are stationary or I don't know if it's India sinking, but the sea level rise has it appearing as if they're sinking. Out in the Pacific and some of those places where we have heard the stories of people that are gonna have to leave the islands within the next 20 years. And we also heard the tragic tale of some of those islands where they're, you know, the colony, I use the word colony, but they're under the, you know, governorship of a bigger place, and they don't want the people to come.
Yeah.
To the mainland.
It is something we're
So
seeing, particularly in the Pacific, but
in the
also
Pacific,
on a recent trip that BAP did to Panama, we actually learned that there's an island there that they've had to evacuate persons to the mainland for that same reason. So I think those impacts are now beginning to be felt in other areas as well.
It's quite terrifying, actually. But Barbados, because it is actually rising, yes, the impacts would be less. To answer your question.
All right.
Less
So we have a
than.
question.
Thank you.
Thanks, Monique, for the question. I have a question from Luther Goodman.
Mhm.
Has the Coastal Zone Management Unit considered beach reclamation methods to restore beaches from erosion?
Yes, sir. So, actually, the boardwalk is one of those jobs because there was no beach. It depends how old you are. So, like me, I remember when there was beach, but then as I grew older, already there's beach now by KFC and all those along the boardwalk. There was no beach along there. You couldn't walk along the beach there. All by you couldn't, you would be in the water from Rockley, probably down to Coconut Court. So we had mostly and that picture show of that beach is artificial. That's not a natural beach. We put those beaches in there.
And tell us about Miami Beach, Antonio. Don't forget that one.
Well, Miami Beach is a Miami Beach is a mistake, actually. Miami Beach was built when the Coast Guard was attempting to build a jetty, stone jetty. Where at Miami Beach, where you see the lifeguard hut, they were trying to build a jetty there. But at that time, there was no analysis of the sediment transport, directions, how much sand was moving in the system. So when they built that shore perpendicular structure, the sand that was coming around from the southeast coast got trapped behind the boulder structure and built the beach. They then tried to extend the structure, and the beach kept on building. And that's why it's actually called Enterprise Beach, but it's called Miami. They call it Miami because people would see beaches like that in Miami where you have structures and a beach built behind it, and they call it Miami Beach because it's actually, the water again was right up to the cliff face. That's an artificial beach as well. Yeah. So the problem with the issue with building beaches, though, is a tender balance because Barbados is full of fringing reefs. And in building out beaches, you gotta be careful you don't smother the reefs that are in near shore. Now, having said that, there was a time on the West Coast when I was back in the 80s and so on and 70s when I was growing up, where the beaches were much wider. And it shows, if you look at some of the near shore fringing reefs, if you look at the section of the reef that close to the shore, you realize it's just the substrate. It's not actual, there's no coral there. And that's because there was a time when that was actually covered in sand. But of course, you know, the things in the works, they're talking about islands and different things, and land reclamation at different points will be on the coastline, the West Coast. The Prime Minister is quite keen to look at some reclamation projects. So, but yes, we have done a bit on a smaller scale at Welch's and at Rockleaf as well.
All right,
Okay.
so Marissa's come now and throw the cat amongst the pigeons, as it were. She's asking, in relation to the vegetation planting, wouldn't the rising temperatures and the acidity of the ocean affect the growth of coral and seagrass? Is planting still an option in the age of climate change?
Right. So
Not Marissa, that wasn't me that wrote that, by the way.
well,
Oh, sorry, that's
no,
Monique. Oh, I thought, sorry, I saw M. My apologies, Marissa.
It's Monique?
It's Monique, yes.
Yes. So I am so glad you asked that question, my dear, because I am not a marine biologist though, but I listen to them in the office when they're talking. So currently, there is a lot of the reefs are bleached of Barbados waters because of the temperature of the water. It was very high last year. It didn't drop during the winter. And so there's been a lot of bleaching of the corals. But our corals also suffering from a stony coral tissue loss disease, which is nothing to do with temperature. It's a disease that actually destroying the reef. So what has happened, what I've been seeing happening though is that in Australia and these places where the coral labs, they're now working on looking at the corals that are most resistant to temperature, heat, and trying to grow those particular corals. But right now, yes, the water temperature is a problem for the corals. There's a lot of coral loss worldwide, and the hope is that the corals will find some way to adapt because life tends to do that. And there are some corals that are more resistant to the heat, it appears. But unless we stop this, my marine biologists tell me that there will come a point though where if the water keeps rising, that it just will not. And that can cause a problem because the corals are probably the largest inverted commas forest on the planet, and it sequesters the most carbon. So if we destroy the corals, then we can have a real problem. Not only from, well, a big problem because then there'll be more carbon, but then the corals also protect the coast from the waves, natural protection, and provide a habitat for the fish, etc., etc., etc.
A multi-dimensional issue.
Yes, it is.
All right, question from Tishawn Archer. How will the sensitive areas such as the Queen Elizabeth Hospital and Light and Power be accommodated in relation to coastal defenses for the short term until they are able to relocate further inland?
Truthfully, the Barbados Light and Power on the coast, that would be down Spring Garden, I suspect he's speaking about more so than the other one, because that's elevated. Yeah, many years ago, they initially actually built a set of groins outside their property to build up the beach in front of their property. So that's what they did in that regard. Now, we have met with them since though, because as part of the Coastal Risk Assessment and Management Program, we would have done vulnerability assessments to different hazard assessments, looking at storm surge, earthquakes, terrestrial flooding, coastal flooding, etc., tsunamis. And they have actually asked for that information, which we shared with them, so that they could, when they were looking at doing, looking at their generators, where they were, to see if they were going to be impacted and if they can elevate them, because we gave them some elevation maps and where we expect storm surge to come. We don't expect the buildings to get damaged or not like on television, because we don't have that kind of water depth to have big waves that are knocking down skyscrapers and so on. So let me get that out of the way first. That's not our reality. Our water is not that deep offshore for that to happen. What you're mostly protecting yourself against is actually more flooding from the sea, not structural damage per se. So the Power are looking at elevating their critical infrastructure, if they can, off the floor levels based on what we gave them. Queen Elizabeth Hospital now is a bit further inland, they are more susceptible to terrestrial flooding than storm surge. So, but it's been there forever. I heard that there's a plan to relocate. But there's nothing, I don't think there's much they can do now because that building is already set in stone the way it's built. But
It's set in concrete, Antonio, but we
set in
won't get
concrete,
into
sorry, I'm a civil engineer. I should know better. Yeah, so that's the challenge there. You see, the problem is that all of that area, if you look at old Barbados, all of that, is a floodplain. All the way St. Michael's School and all of River Road, hence the name. That is where the water is supposed to go. And unfortunately, when people were deciding to develop that part of them, when they tried to canalize the Constitution River, which the entire floodplain extended all the way, taking up with diffusion and NASCO and all that, was they trying to control that. But the reality is that when the water comes, when there's enough water, it will go where it goes naturally. And I am not sure if there's any consideration right now given to any changes in elevation around by the QAH to help divert that water somewhere else. But you don't just want to divert it somewhere else, because you just move the problem from the QAH to someplace else.
Deshaun does raise an interesting quandary that faces obviously a lot of coastal development, because traditionally we know that our capital cities usually have fallen on coastlines. And in places like Jakarta, where they're actually looking to relocate a whole city because of the challenges they're having there. Are we then saying that going forward, we need to be telling or indicating to government that they need to start looking seriously at relocating those assets for the country that could shut us completely down further inland going forward?
Yes. So what we had to do when in the 1990s, there was a study done, a climate change study looking at sea level rise impacts and so on. And literally we looked at the 1 in 50-year return period, 1 in 100-year return period, and looked at the inundation or potential flooding. And this is just from storm surge and waves. And drew that line along the coast. And almost all of our coastal roads and everything were in the 1 in 100 for sure. That water was coming that far in. So all of our critical infrastructure for the most part, all the hotel plants, at that time it would have been gas stations, before the fire station at Westernmoor, fire stations, police stations, all on the coast, all of that would have been impacted by the inundation. So what is going to happen? What happened now? We've updated that map with the new infrastructure, and what we're trying to do now is let people know that in any future infrastructure, since we have this information, will now have to be built to proof itself against the flooding. Right. So elevated floor levels and stuff like that. So we have handed a lot of that information over to the respective, and the coastal roads as well. No, mostly coastal roads are quite low, and there's not much you can do about that. So that's why in the future now, there's some work proposed that coastal works proposed at Clinton and even the Belches project. That when I was a child, I used to go travel that road to go to the airport because there was no highways. And the water would come into the road, they'd be passing the city water over into the road. And that's one of the reasons we did that work, because we had to stop the water from impacting that road, the retaining wall that keeps the road in place. The way to do that was to build the beach there and use Bajan terms, push the sea back so that the waves will not overtop the road any further. And there's some future work scheduled for the same Sand Street and Clinton to do the same thing, because we can't raise the level of the roads. So we're going to have to find a way to keep the sea, to put the sea back by either enhancing the beach strips there and vegetation and so on and so forth.
Okay.
So there are coastal infrastructure, yes. So the critical infrastructure and the same thing with the planning when the hotels submit their applications, it's the same thing. You got to tell them what we see as the potential impacts from the storm surge and the inland flooding, because that's both waters meet at the coastline. And then give that information so they can design their buildings mostly against flooding, to proof themselves against that thing, against the flooding and so on. So not generators on the ground and stuff like that.
All right, so as we come around the home stretch, as it were, last couple of questions coming at you. This one is from one of our colleagues at BAP. Is the preservation of reefs a critical factor in the determination of the location of coastal zone structures? Do some of these structures promote coral growth?
Yes, so as part of the whole environmental impact assessment section of the coastal engineering work, probably back in the day, not so much, but now, when you understand what the reef also can contribute, especially in Barbados, because while I've been speaking here about reefs protecting the coastline, one of the real properties that the reef possess, especially in Barbados, is that the reef produces sand. They're coral island. So the reef, one of the services that the reef provides is sand production. Unfortunately, it does that when it's healthy, and right now the reefs are not healthy. So that's another issue. But yes, when you are looking at coastal engineering projects, one of the first things you have to do is look and see what existing ecosystems are there and minimize, either eliminate or anything you're doing to try to minimize the impact on the coral. So if you have, and I know this is a very touchy issue, if you have actual corals, because don't forget, we don't want to mix up the corals, the terms coral and reef. Reef is the corals plus the reef, the substrate. So if you're designing coastal engineering structures and there are actual corals in the vicinity, then you're not allowed to put boulders on top of corals. Now, truth be told, there are some projects that are of national significance and is written into our act. If a project is of national significance, like a port expansion project, per se, or, build a new port or something, then what you're gonna have to do is try and minimize the impact on the corals. So obviously, some of the footprint will probably go across the reef. So what you're trying to do is move those corals. We don't really like transplanting corals, because coral transplantation, moving corals from one place to the next does not mean that if you move 100 coral heads, all 100 will attach and grow. There's some mortality rate to it. So you end up with less corals. So we don't really like that as an option. We don't like people telling us, oh, we can build something and we can move the corals. No, sir. You need to try your best to work with the corals. But I mean, obviously there are times when that can be avoided, so the corals are transplanted.
Okay. I think
or seagrasses for that matter. No, not seagrasses. Just don't mess with seagrasses. Just don't go around there.
Right. So we had some back ends. I think that was just some conversation, more sort of questions there. I think the last question I'll put to you, Antonio. We are aware, of course, of the substantial development happening between the Pierhead and the Barbados Defense Force, and then we see continued development going up the coast. What advice are you giving to those developers at this stage, and what responsibility is the planning department placing on those developers in terms of protecting our coastline?
Okay, so as I said before, or let me back up a bit. The coastal zone management unit has a coastal zone, integrated coastal zone management plan. And within that plan, they set out, just like the PDP, certain rules that we think that the coastal planning should try to abide by as much as it can to ensure the protection of the coastal ecosystems and so on. So Pierhead, that Pierhead development, the one that you all see going on where all the buildings have been knocked down, that is a hotel that's actually being built on that same concrete base. Of course, a lot of that land is reclaimed, so I believe that that's going to be a lot of that going to be foundation with piles. They are not actually coming onto the beach. But anytime we see there's a potential development and you are looking to make your way onto the sand, our recommendations is like that. To town planning is that no. We don't come to the point where you don't want to seem to be an obstructionist and tell people, well, then you can't do anything at all. We usually ask them to try and reimagine the project, just staying off the beach. So we know we tried with we know we had put certain planning, we had made some recommendations also for Hayat and all those proposed developments along Carlisle Bay as an example, because we know that Carlisle Bay is probably one of the last bays with that kind of wide beach vegetation in the background, and it's widely used by the public, both local and so we try to impose our setbacks. Our setbacks are a minimum of 30, but on a beach like that, when we know the beach is like 60, you could bet your bottom dollar that you can get a setback at 40, at 50. A recommendation as to keep you off the beach. But as I said, though, those are just recommendations that then go to planning based on the planning laws before the new Planning Development Act. Those our recommendations would then be sent compiled with all the other recommendations from the other agencies, and that will go to the Minister of Planning to make a decision. And usually the Minister of Planning would be, would make a decision that aligns with ours. Now there's a board. So the recommendations go to the board. However, the minister can still call any application. The Minister of Planning, that portfolio is usually held by the minister, because in the coastal area is quite important for all kinds of reasons, mostly for economics. So, to be fair, where we sit at coastal, it's not that we don't consider economics, but we don't make that kind of evaluation. We understand that we are a coastal tourism place, and therefore when applications come before us, we will never have an attitude to tell things, say that things can't happen. Because people need to work and jobs and so on. But primarily our focus is on environment. So our recommendations are heavily biased towards environmental preservation and sustainable development.
Yeah.
When it leaves us though, and it goes to other people, they may have to consider other things, social and economic considerations that we don't have. And so I'm just saying that to say that then when the decision is made, it may not always align with ours because they have other considerations.
Yeah.
Which are important as well.
Antonio Rowe, we want to thank you so much for really sharing with us this evening quite a bit of information and for going over time. Please do extend our thanks to Dr. Bruce, who would have given permission, obviously, for you to represent Coastal Zone here this evening. This session this evening was recorded and will be available on the BAP website in a couple of weeks' time. So for those who would have missed anything, who might have joined late, you can go on there and you can avail yourself of the presentation. And certainly if you do have questions as it pertains to development along our coastline, I would encourage you to reach out to Coastal Zone. They have a lot of professionals there who can advise you accordingly or direct you accordingly as it pertains to your queries and comments. So, Antonio, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was really good being here. Thank you very much for asking.
No problem, man. Thanks very much. I thought it was timely given the experience that we all would have just gone through with Hurricane Beryl. I thought that was this was something that we needed to share. So thanks again. And Kenton, if you can, before we go, I just want to remind everybody about the events that are coming up, if you can put up the flyer. So just a quick reminder before we go, guys. We do have our week of activities coming up for the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers, the 60th anniversary events. Our church service is going to be the 29th of September. We'll have a webinar on the 1st. We'll have a special tour and a members line on the 2nd. And then our awards dinner under the patronage of Her Excellency, the President, is going to be on the 4th. So look out for the information that's going to be coming out. And also, we'll be sharing some information in about a week's time as it pertains to our September webinar. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. I do wish you a good night.
Take care. Thanks a lot. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.